When I was a kid, I had my very second-hand Yashica J5, which served me well, but I always yearned for an Olympus OM10, like the one my brother had. Skip forward to when I got back into film photography a few years ago, and those old Olympus cameras were still looking very attractive. At that time, the OM10s seemed to be fetching quite a high price, often selling for more than an OM1, which doesn't really make much sense, so I decided to look for an OM20 instead. The OM20 having full manual control without the need for an additional manual adapter, and at that time they were largely overlooked and therefore pretty cheap to buy. A non-working example popped up, complete with two lenses, for about £20, so I bought it. Both lenses were a bit fungusy and in need of a clean. I'll talk more about the lenses later in the video, but the camera was as described and was completely dead. The battery contacts looked to be in good condition, but once I'd removed the top of the camera, no electricity was getting to the main circuit board. I decided to remove the battery holder, which on the OM20 and probably the OM10 as well, also forms the spindle for the take-up spool, so a little care is needed. With that removed, the fault was easy to see. The wire had corroded off the back of the contact spring. Maybe there had been a little battery leakage at some time, or possibly an owner with very sweaty hands. But anyway, after a bit of careful soldering, the camera was back working as it should be. The OM20 was released somewhere around 1983 to supersede, or at least complement, the OM10. But the ever-popular OM10 wasn't going anywhere, and it's still listed as a current model in this 1988 copy of Amateur Photographer magazine, by which time the OM20 was long forgotten, the other two-digit model now being the OM40. Funnily enough, since getting the OM20, I was given an OM10. This one doesn't work yet, but I haven't really looked at it, apart from cleaning off most of the mouse poo. Wherever it had been stored, a mouse decided the camera bag would be a good place to set up home. Anyway, I'll take a quick look round the OM20 and then show some of the shots taken using it. A tiny addition that I rather like is this little grip. It just makes hanging onto the camera that bit easier. But it is removable, so I'd be willing to bet that it's missing on some examples. Beside that is the film rewind release knob. Rotate this anti-clockwise to release drive to the sprocket wheels in order to rewind the film. The knob automatically returns to the driven position when you advance the film again. Over on the other side there's not much, just the flash sync socket, should you wish to use off-camera wired flash. As with other Olympus models, the lens release button is on the lens itself, rather than on the body of the camera. To install a lens, line up the red dot on the lens with the red dot on the mount, and rotate the lens clockwise until it clicks into position. The other button on the lens is the depth of field preview button. Behind the lens mount is the shutter speed ring, with speeds ranging from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. Bulb mode is set using one of the top dials. On the top corner of the mount is a red LED. This illuminates when you use the battery check function and also when the self-timer is counting down. On the left of the top plate is the fairly normal film rewind crank, which also doubles up as the back door release when you pull it upwards. Around that is the power and mode switch. Auto sets the camera into aperture priority auto mode, where you select the aperture and the camera picks the appropriate shutter speed. Check is the battery test. If the batteries are OK, the LED on the front of the camera will illuminate and the camera will give a continuous bleep. Off clearly turns the camera off, except that if you do take a photo with the switch in the off position, the camera will still give you a correctly exposed shot, the same as if it was in the auto position, but in this case the exposure meter won't be illuminated. Manual sets the camera to fully manual mode, where you select both the aperture using the aperture ring on the lens and the shutter speed using the ring behind the lens mount. And finally bulb. This will generally be used with the camera mounted on a tripod and a cable release attached to avoid camera shake during long exposures. The shutter will remain open while the shutter release button is pressed. In the middle is the hot shoe, and to the right of that is the exposure compensation dial that you rotate to overexpose by up to 2 stops, and similarly to underexpose by up to 2 stops. This dial also sets the film speed. Lift up the outer ring to select film speeds between 25 ISO and 1600 ISO. To get from one end of the scale to the other, you'll need to release the outer ring and rotate the dial at least a couple of times before you reach the other end. In practice, this isn't really a hassle, as you'll likely only be changing film speeds every now and then. Sharing the same centre point is the self-timer lever. Move this backwards to engage the self-timer. When you press the red shutter button, the camera will bleep and flash the red LED for around 13 seconds before the shot is taken, giving you plenty of time to run round and include yourself in the action. Just in front of the self-timer lever is the shutter release button. Touch this lightly to turn the exposure meter on if it's gone to sleep, which it does after a minute or so of inactivity. Then press it fully to take the shot. You can use a standard threaded cable release when using the camera on a tripod. The film advance lever has a relatively short throw, and as with many cameras will rest slightly away from the camera body for easy access, and then push back into the body for storage. Although the lever might feel a little plasticky, that's only a trim piece. There's a metal lever hidden beneath the plastic, so it won't break unless you drop it. The same applies for the camera chassis. I've read many articles saying that the OM10 and 20 have a plastic chassis, but this isn't correct. The top and bottom covers, along with the housing at the back of the lens, are plastic, but the camera chassis is metal. Lastly on the top plate is the frame counter, which auto-resets when you open the back of the camera. On the back is the Viewfinder eyepiece. I find the Olympus Viewfinders very clear and easy to see through, with no need to make a special diopter like I had to for the Nikon EM. Below that is a film reminder holder, another thing I always like to have on a camera so I don't forget what film I'm shooting with, which is often a possibility keeping around 15 cameras loaded at any time. On the bottom is the tripod socket in the centre, with the battery hatch over to the right. The OM20 takes two SR44 or LR44 batteries, positive side facing outwards. There's also a motor drive coupling and electrical connections for the motor drive. As I said earlier, the viewfinder is bright and clear. There's a split image focusing aid in the middle with a micro prism around that. On the left hand side is the exposure meter. In auto mode this shows you what speed the camera will take the shot at, and in manual mode it displays the speed that it thinks you should be using, but there's no indication of what speed you've actually selected, so you do need to check on the front of the camera. It does display that it's in manual mode above the exposure meter as a reminder. If there's too much light, the exposure meter will display the overexposure warning, in which case you'll need to select a smaller aperture. If you dial in some exposure compensation, an orange plus-minus sign will display beneath the exposure meter, and there's also a flash ready light that will appear between the overexposure and manual indicators. Loading a film is easy enough. Pull up the rewind crank to open the back of the camera. Drop in your roll of film. Push the rewind crank back in, maybe giving it a slight jiggle to get it to engage with the film cassette. Pull the leader across and feed the end into one of the slots in the take-up spool. Advance the film, making sure it's still engaged with the take-up spool and with the teeth in the drive sprocket. Take up any slack by gently rotating the rewind crank backwards so the film sits flat along the film guides, and shut the back. Either take the lens cap off or set the camera to manual and fire a shot. If you leave the lens cap on, the camera will do a very long exposure. If you forget, just change it to manual and the exposure will finish. Wind on and fire a couple more frames, and then you're ready to go out and snap some shots. When you get to the end of the film, rotate the rewind release knob anti-clockwise. Flip out the rewind crank and rotate it in the direction of the arrow. You should feel the tension ease as the film is released from the take-up spool. Carry on winding a few more turns, then open the back and remove the film cassette ready for processing. OK, it's now time to take a look at some of the shots taken using the OM20, and then I'll talk a little more about the light meter, lenses and so on. Unlike many through-lens metering systems, the OM20, and the OM10 for that matter, measures the light reflecting off the film plane rather than measuring it somewhere up in the prism area. This is arguably more accurate, but in practice I found both systems very satisfactory, assuming the meter is working as it should be. If I fire the shutter in bulb mode, you can see the light sensor located in the bottom of the mirror box and angled towards the film plane. This system measures the light during the exposure and ends the exposure once enough light has hit the film. If I dim the lights and stop down to f16 and fire off a shot, it takes over 3 seconds to complete the exposure. Now if I repeat this, but just after I've started the exposure I'll turn the lights back on, the exposure will end almost immediately. Thusly, the very common Olympus Zuiko 50mm f1.8 lenses that were often the kit lens with these cameras are a great little lens, and they are really compact compared to earlier 50mm lenses. They are sharp and produce really nice images, however they do often suffer from a slight problem. If they haven't been stored well, they can develop some fungus, a problem common to all lenses, but they have a habit of getting fungus within the front group, which is bonded into a single housing, so there's not a lot you can do about that. I have 4 copies of this lens, and 3 out of 4 suffer the same issue. That said, the rest of the lens can still be cleaned, and I've shot with them, fungus and all, and they still perform brilliantly. Additionally, if you're using the lens regularly and not storing it in dark, damp conditions, the fungus tends to stay as it is rather than continuing to grow inside the bonded group. Olympus weren't alone in making uncleanable bonded groups, it's just something that you have to live with on the newer vintage lenses like this. Right, time to take a look at a few more shots taken on the OM20 and then a few more thoughts. Since getting the OM20, it's become my most used film camera. It's my go-to little workhorse. If I want to use auto exposure, I know I can trust it, yet I still have full manual at the flick of a switch. It's compact and lightweight, particularly if I throw on the 50mm f1.8 rather than the 1.4 or any of my other lenses. The Viewfinder is brilliant, and above all I think the Olympus SLRs of the late 70s and early 80s were the prettiest SLRs of that period, but I guess that's a matter of opinion. Anyway, I think that will probably do for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.